NYE Myco 2019 into 2020. I worked at Pottery East until 8:30 on New Year's Eve. Once home, I rushed to get all of my things put away as quickly as possible so that I could get to work on my Myco Spawn smoothie. The ingredients were coconut yogurt, banana, pineapple, ginger, and matcha to promote a healthy ecology on the digestion. The taste of the Myco Spawn was hardly detectable as I slurped down the creamy green shake, and I consumed a bit of green power before Omar caught us an Uber ride down to the beach. Our Uber driver was more talkative than they usually are, and at points it was difficult to manage during the come-up. He definitely knew what he was doing driving-wise, though the occasional recklessness turned me into an internal backseat driver, half preparing for my imminent death. The conversation remained light and fun though, as I held on and managed myself like someone who had, well, taken Myco Spawn as many times in their life as I had. If I could get over being convinced that I was dead and that my friend was the devil leading me to death, then I could handle half the amount of Myco Spawn on New Year's Eve in the back of an Uber. Somehow the topic of meeting ladies at the beach came up, and the driver told us a story about his friend buying 2 beers at a time at the bar and just walking around with both in his hands, offering one to whichever woman he fancied most. The idea made me laugh, perhaps a very strange Myco Spawn laugh, but it also struck me as oddly genius. With this model of attraction, one is bound to end up with a lover in most cases, I imagined. Whether it would attract the right people is another story, but at least it's a friendly way to meet people as long as expectations are kept at bay. Perhaps I'd thought about romance all wrong. Perhaps it was as simple as walking around with 2 beers as a means of trial and error. This very basic human interaction put me in positive spirits, as I realised that if I were simply under the influence of alcohol, I'd probably just be having a carefree conversation with this jolly Uber driver, assuming that, of course, I wasn't going to die. We got dropped off by a neighbourhood relatively close to the beach and thanked the driver for his time. Omar wanted me to see how cool this neighbourhood was, what with the perfectly manicured hedgerows and wildly expensive homes, the practical mansions. It was eerie how quiet it was, even though it made sense given the holiday. Again, I felt a profound realization come over me. Everyone just wanted to be somewhere else for New Year's, to be where everyone else was. The result was miles upon miles of deserted upper-scale housing, almost like a set for a movie or a town in a Pokemon game. Shadows wiggled, and objects appeared cartoonish in the dark, almost like they were made of clay. I enjoyed this visual entourage and felt like I had become acclimated to the great unknown. Surely there would be nothing more to worry about. We walked around making jokes and made our way to a ramp that descended the cliff, bridged over a highway, and landed us onto the beach. On our way down the ramp, we passed by a homeless man who was hitting sticks against the concrete, mumbling nonsense and sounding a bit angry. Suddenly, my sense of complete security I had just established was significantly dampened because I had forgotten I had the homeless to worry about. Then I thought about that thought. Did I really have the homeless to worry about? How many of them were actually dangerous? And how many of them were just mentally ill with no one helping them? And how many were both? I reckoned it was good to be cautious, just in case they were engaging with the bad salts of insanity. But still I questioned my initial instinct that the bulk of them were dangerous. Deciding not to dwell on it any longer, we made our way onto a boardwalk on the beach and walked by a busy party, something that seemed rather exclusive and hosted by a rich, frisky individual. The music was god-awful, and I scoffed at the idea of people who heard such music and got excited about possibly having the night of their lives. But I was quick to correct my judgment, to be more tolerant of the tastes of others. The rush continued to rise as I felt a wave of ecstasy, It was as if I was on the edge of the earth as I faced the Black Sea, and the shadows reduced the surrounding landscape to abstract forms. Omar motioned me to gaze at the pier to our left, and the dazzling display of lights was just what my myco-spawn eyes needed. A Ferris wheel was lit up with a countdown until 2020, and the rest of the pier was covered in colourful lights as well, some blinking and the others dormant. What I could see looked like a wavy blob of massive light pixels, and I laughed in delight at the visual power of my homegrown myco-spawn. Omar suggested we walk to the pier and then walk back to our current general area to set up our blanketed spot for the countdown. Walking to the pier and back, I pondered. What was the worst that could happen walking to the pier and back? Naturally, the closer we got to the pier, the more people we started to become surrounded by. Of course, they were there for the same reason, so what did I have to worry about? Absolutely nothing. But as I gazed around, I realized that I couldn't really see any of these people's faces, nor the finer details of their clothing, due to the bright lights shining our way, half blinding us, and half casting shadows on the people. I felt paranoia rise that Omar was bringing me to the pier for some sinister reason. Was he not leading me to some demise? Was he not acting odd this whole time, like he was trying to stay focused on some task? I tried with all my might to shoo those notions away, but as we got closer to the underbelly of the pier, the closer my descent into the abyss of no return seemed to be. There we stood on the edge of the pier, my mental noise louder than ever, and nothing but darkness ahead. If there were goblins anywhere, they were probably there. "Please don't make me go in there, man, I won't," I said, a little too enthusiastically. Omar laughed. "Of course not, man. Let's just turn around." We turned around, and instantly the mood shifted upward, as the light illuminated the faces and finer details of those we had just walked by, and the shadows were now literally behind us. Wow, man. It's amazing how much less scary everyone is when you leave their shadows behind, I uttered quietly, pleased with myself. It was another one of those hallmark moments. There were children splashing in the water, families and couples gathered on blankets, and people playing music out of stereo systems. Nothing out of the ordinary to be worried about. On the way towards the pier, the little kids had looked like little gremlins, and the couples on the hills looked like mysterious shadow figures on surveillance. Just when I thought the bulk of the anxiety was over, we came across a couple of people trying to light a firework off of the beach, rather close to the water. I don't know how much of my visual misunderstanding had to do with lack of firework knowledge or being close to my myco-spawn peak, but it looked nothing like a firework to me, and more like something that was bound to explode without ever making it to the sky. "Omar, what the fuck are they doing?" "Oh, huh." He seemed unshaken. "I'm not sure. Firework. Why did people have to be setting things on fire on the beach?" I hurried us along and urged Omar to pick the spot for us to sit, where we could be far enough away from everyone so that no one could hear me speak. He followed suit, and we secured a patch of sand for the blanket to be thrown. I sat down and realized I was breathing rather quickly, and realized that I was a lot more paranoid and anxious than I was letting myself be aware of. Moreover, by running away from it, I was only making myself more paranoid and anxious. I started to take hold of my breath and lay down. I realized that I had to focus on my breath only, something that is usually a bit hard for me to do, a bit too simple, if that makes sense. As I breathed and looked up at the night sky, I realized that all my paranoia and anxieties were actual voices of ego chatter, a whole bunch of them in ensemble, all trying to scare me from breaking free. I invited a presence to come in and stomp out the chatter with me, and suddenly thought of Ram Dass. He had just died, and though I didn't follow him extremely, I respected his work and what he stood for. This thought of Ram Dass and his energy coincided with the arrival of an orb of force, something that came into my psyche and pushed out the negative voices. The voices suddenly vanished, just as a fire that has been doused by water. Once the chatter ended, I was left with a cleansing, slightly visible orb of peace before me. I remained still and enjoyed this pure bliss, this realm of powerful emptiness free of egoic concerns. After a few minutes, the apparent presence of Ram Dass dissipated, and I was left feeling more or less at baseline consciousness as I sat up. "Whoa," I said quickly, like waking up from a nap I didn't plan on taking. "That was incredible, dude. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I feel like Ram Dass just visited me and stomped out the demons." "Sounds lit," Omar said as he laughed. He liked to make understatements. I felt immense satisfaction. The Myco spawn had led me far enough into the great unknown so that I would feel a little fear, far enough to experience beautiful visual displays, and far enough to have a spiritual moment of overcoming negative mental chatter. The fear had been enough, but not too much. The experience had all the elements of a classic Myco spawn trip, and all within just 2.5 hours, a much faster pace than normal. With my mind emptied of hyper-self-aware thinking, I shifted my attention toward Omar and could feel his emotional state, deep into several alcoholic beverages. The information he shared is private, but I learned a whole lot more about how Omar felt on a day-to-day basis, and it seemed to be because of my strengthened receptivity to others' mental states. I really did feel that going deeper into the great unknown could be good for him, but to each their own, of course, when it comes to power experiences. Lights still danced and shadows tended towards unusual morphology, but I was mostly back to participating in the usual human perceptual story. Right as Omar and I closed our deep conversation about his emotional life, the countdown to 2020 began on the Ferris wheel. The decade was really about to end. I thought about the other time I had tripped on New Year's and realised that it was 10 years prior on my second Myco spawn trip ever, trekking in the snowy darkness with Leaf, Tree Demon and Tito, with little intention other than to be mystified. How serendipitous it felt to have entered this decade on a Myco spawn trip, and to end it on one as well. 2019 itself had been a year filled with power experiences far and wide, and my relationship with the great unknown had been full spectrum. I had evolved into a Myco spawn cultivator, a self-reliant psychonaut, and a less fearful frequenter of the great unknown. The clock hit 0, and the fireworks started as Omar popped a bottle of cheap champagne, a bottle he bought simply for the purpose of popping. The moment was sweet and energetic, yet the cultural unlearning of the Myco spawn experience also made me feel like something about the tropes of this holiday were a little stupid. Either way, I chuckled and sparked up an epic cone of green power for me and Omar to share. What a crazy time. Choking down green power on the Myco spawn come down, gazing out at the dark Pacific. We goofed about on the beach before heading back to the streets and past a group of people blasting and singing Firework by Katy Perry. I couldn't help but grin in the face of such sheer positivity. Pop music was at least good for that, I reckoned. Then there was another moaning, percussive homeless man to dodge on the ramp up, and we watched all the posh-looking folks getting their acts together after their New Year's Eve out on the town. One man was yelling at his friends on the phone for being kicked out of a party, while other fancy couples simply looked bored as they caught their limos. An Armenian fellow with a nice car swept us up and got us home safe and sound as he enjoyed my excessive joking, something I tended towards on psychedelic come-downs. At home, I consumed more green power and watched a documentary all about the stuff. It seemed green power was becoming more and more normalised, another big change to notice from the decade, and I felt myself excited for the next decade to come. Myco Spawn welcomed a presence into my mind to stomp out the demons and provided a blank slate for the new year.